All right, we'll get started. Yes, you do have a test this week, due by Sunday night. No, this is a test. This is a test. It's over six. It's over chapters 6 through 10. 5 chapters. It's everything we've covered since the last test. Okay, so review your textbook, chapters 6 through 10. Look over your notes that hopefully you're taking from the lectures, and then you should do okay. Yes.
And did you have the last week?
Last week we didn't have it on Thursday, but I did put stuff up to watch online. Yeah, I wasn't here because I was at a conference. All right. Everybody ready? Good. Good. Yeah, we got a test coming up. It's multiple guess. I call it multiple guess. I was given a test one day, and I saw this guy in the back of the room. He's a good student because he sat in the back. And he's sitting back there taking the test, multiple choice. And he's got a quarter out. He's flipping a quarter. And he's flipping a quarter. He's flipping a quarter. He's writing stuff down. So he gets all his answers written down. He starts to pack up his stuff and get up. And then he sits down again, gets the quarter back out, doing it again. So when he gets done, he comes up. I said, I figure you're choosing your answers by flipping the coin. He said, yeah, if it's heads, it's either A or B. If it's heads again, it's A. If it's tails, it's either C or D. If it's tails again, it's D. Okay. I said, all right, I get that. But then, I saw you get up, and then you sat back down, and you're flipping the coin again. What was that about? He said, well, I was checking my answers. Just checking his answers. Anyway, that's actually just a story. I know I shouldn't tell you it's a story. I just let you think it's true. I just made it up. Occasionally I do that sort of thing. I tell stories. Stories are sometimes rooted in a kernel of truth. I have had students take tests. That part's true. It's just like when you go watch these films that are historical films, people come back and ask me, is that film correct? I'll say, well, there were, say, Romans and somebody else, and they did fight each other. That part's true. All the rest of it, not so much. Anyway, so keep that in mind when you take your test. Keep a quarter handy. Or, something else. I don't know. Dice. You throw dice. All right. He looks like he's not sure if he wants to come in here. He's having second thoughts. Well, then you should be refreshed and ready to go. I think he should go over there and buy everybody in the class one of those milkshakes because, he just looks like the kind of guy that's generous and wealthy. Okay. That would only cost you about, $200 to buy everybody. Like $5 each. So we got, well, not, no, maybe less than $100 you could do that. That would be great, a great treat that someone could do for us. All right. So our test covers chapters 6 through 10. So 5 chapters, everything since the last test. Okay, so it's sort of the end of the Romans and up through the medieval stuff. Then our next test, will be at the end. That'll be over 5 chapters as well, 11 through 15. Okay. Well, let's take a look now. We've mentioned feudalism, but we had not actually, I guess maybe defined it. Your textbook defines it, but I just want to make sure we're clear on it. It's very important in the medieval period to understand feudalism. Feudalism is not only found in Europe, medieval Europe. Feudalism is a system. It's you might call it an economic system, a social agreement. Why do people choose feudalism? In part, they choose feudalism because their population is low. They have a limited number of people. So this isn't up on the screen, but if we want to kind of know the why does feudalism happen? It definitely happens in Japan. It will definitely happen in parts in China and some other parts of the world as well. What it basically is, it's a system based upon land. All right, we don't have a huge population, right? So we can't have everybody specialized. The way we think about military things today is somebody joins the military or they're asked to join, right? They are made to join. They're drafted, right? They volunteer or not. Right now we have a voluntary army. So once somebody joins that military, then for whatever period of time that they're in the military, that's their job, right? I mean, that's what they're doing. That's their primary thing that they do. So maybe that's for a couple of years, or maybe they make it into a career. In medieval times, we don't have enough people and resources to be able to do something like that. That's called a standing army, where you just have a bunch of soldiers just sort of sitting around, ready to go whenever is needed. Of course, you got to feed them. They probably want to be paid. And what we tend to do in our military is we also expect the military to provide, say, all of your weapons, your uniforms, all that kind of stuff, right? So if you signed up for the military, you would expect them, if they want you to wear a uniform, that they provide it for you. They don't make you go buy it, or the boots, or the gun, or whatever it is you're going to have to use. But not so in medieval times. You outfitted yourself. These are a few things to keep in mind. You had to outfit yourself, and we don't really have the resources to pay you. So how do we ever form a military? If we need to go into battle, somebody's getting ready to attack us, what are we going to do? Just let them take over? Well, that's one option. But usually we try to fight. How are we going to do that? Feudal system provides a way that you can create a military, an army, when you need it, but not have to invest the people and the money to have them just sort of sitting around waiting for the next conflict. Right? That makes sense? So, there's a lot of different groups, and we've talked about them, different, like we had different tribes of the Franks and so forth. And we had the Lombards and all these other groups, all these Germanic groups, and different people that are potentially going to fight. The Saxons fighting Charlemagne and so forth. All these things are factors that are going to lead to military conflict. But if you are the king, let's say, you don't have the resources to say, well, I've got 10,000 troops over here, and they're just sitting in the barracks or whatever, out on maneuvers, and I just call them up when I need them. So how do I do that? Well, the main commodity, as far as financial, is land. Land is the basis of power. The king controls all the land. So normally this is represented, I just borrowed this from an internet source, but it's a triangle. So I didn't draw this one myself. I know you're disappointed. I didn't draw this one. But basically it's a pyramid, top down. King's at the top, everybody else down below. So the king, technically in a medieval society, controls all the land. All the land belongs to the king. Now, obviously the king, doesn't have the resources as well to take care of all that land, to farm it all, to sort of watch over it all, and so forth. So what the king does, since he has an abundance of land, and he's lacking in military things and service, he trades. He trades some control over land. He still retains ownership, but he trades some of the control of the land in exchange for service and loyalty. So let's say I'm the king. Let's say I've got 1,000, units of land. I would, in this kind of feudal system, divide that up, let's say into 4 parts, 250 units each, roughly. And then I would find, 4 powerful individuals who are capable, that I trusted. I would negotiate with them that they would get to utilize that 250 units. Right? In exchange, what do I want? I want them to take an oath of loyalty to me that says they will obey me, they will protect me, they will serve me, and that sort of thing. They're on my side. And that they will pledge that they will raise an army, they will bring people to come fight on my side if I need it. And usually that was listed as so many days of service a year. We didn't necessarily use all of them, but so maybe it's 100 days of service a year, like a third of the year, something like that. So what that means is I would do that, say, with 3 or 4 individuals under me. Obviously, I would keep some direct land that I would use to make money from and get food, but then I would divvy it out. Technically, I own all the land, but now, let's say the Duke of, I don't know, Lakeland, the Duke of Lakeland has got a unit of land, the Duke of, Tampa or something. So we divide it up, or maybe different counties. We still call them counties. That's a medieval terminology. You had dukes and then you had counts. The count ruled a county. The duke rules a duchy. So the duchy for the duke might be whatever we call this part of Florida. Central, I guess we call it, right? Central Florida, Southern Florida, Northern Florida, whatever. We divide it up and we have dukes over different areas. Now, in turn, those dukes go out and find 3 or 4 individuals that'll pledge loyalty to them and service to them and the king, and they subdivide their land into parcels. And likewise, so that's how you get what you see here. The king, the nobility, they're subdividing this. Loyalty, you see, military aid, and loyalty. That's what we're talking about. Service, military service, and loyalty. Now, below that, of course, you have sort of the next layer. Below the nobility, you would have knights. Knights would be those who would be pledged to a lord, but the lord his lord might be a baron, or it might be a count, or it might be a duke, something like that. And then, so what would happen then is, let's say I'm the king, and I say, look, we got people from Georgia wanting to fight us. We need an army. So we begin to assemble our troops. So then I would turn to the dukes and say, okay, I need you to call up your people. Then they would turn to their people, the dukes to the counts, and say, you need to call up your people. They might turn to the barons, you need to call up your people. And then all the knights and so forth show up at a given location with usually the king and everybody there, and they go into battle. So you might think of those as sort of like platoons or units of the army. All right? Now, the other thing I said is that they do not have, the king does not provide the equipment of war. So it's not like you show up, I don't know, somewhere out in the field, and then, okay, here's 100 horses, and you pick one, or here's armor, here's swords, all that. You have to come with all of that. So if you're going to be a knight, you have to have your own horse, and you got to take care of your horse. If you're ever taking care of horses, it can be expensive and time-consuming. But you have to have your horse, keep your horse in good shape, keep it fed and watered, and have the saddles and the armoring and all the other things that your horse would need. Plus, you need to have it for yourself, along with your swords, along with your lances, whatever else you're going to use in battle. Right? Okay, so you come fully equipped to the battlefield, and that's the responsibility. To be a knight, that's what you had to have. And a knight had to have someone who assisted him, usually called a squire. So each knight was responsible to have his own squire. The squire is the one who would help him store his armor, and help him put everything on, help him get up on his horse, sort of his assistant, right? Somebody's going to help him out, because some of this armor is just really impossible to put on by yourself. So you need somebody to help you. Somebody to hand you, like you get up on the horse, hand you your lance or whatever. That's kind of. So the squire is your assistant. Now, sometimes squires will become knights later on, so they're kind of knights in training. But basically, a squire is an assistant, a worker for a knight. So all this stuff shows up. All these people show up, and all this stuff shows up. to go into battle. Now, when it gets down to the peasants provide their service is, basically they farm the land, they do the work to produce the food. Because we don't have food, well, none of this stuff can happen. The army has to eat, the king has to eat, the nobility has to eat. So if we're going to defend things, we've got to have the food. It's the peasants that do that. In return, you may not know if this is a fair return, but in return, well, I guess you as a peasant would get to eat, and you get protection from the military. So if those terrible people from the north are invading, you're supposedly going to be defended by the military. All right, does that make sense? So that's how this works. That's how this works. The peasants then also often have to pay some form of rent in service or in kind, so they may have to turn over wheat or whatever it is they're growing, and of course they put their time in on that. Yes?
The Lord and the
Dukes?
Dukes, sorry.
Yeah, not Doug.
Do they have to have like a royal blood in them?
Have to have a what kind?
Royal blood.
Royal blood. Well, it is true that nobility is by the blood. It may not necessarily be from the king. But yes, if the reason that, say, someone is a peasant and someone is not a peasant has to do with your birth. Yes. You are born to a line of nobility, or you're not. And if you're born a peasant, you're not going to suddenly become nobility. No. Or you're not going to marry someone and become nobility. Typically, you're not going to, nobility is not going to marry someone who's not noble. Probably wouldn't be allowed. And if they did, it would be very scandalous. So, yes, it's by blood, not necessarily royal blood like the king's bloodline, but nobility bloodlines. There are different families that are royal or noble. We'll call them noble. This is a kind of a holdover from the ancient Romans. The Romans had very strict sort of bloodlines, at least in the beginning. This idea continues here. And so part of it has to do with wealth, but really it has to do ultimately with birth. Okay. So that's why you often find stories, medieval stories of mistaken identity, right? Here is a peasant who looks just like the king. And so somebody goes out and finds this peasant and brings him in as an imposter, and they kidnap the king, and then they try to make the peasant pretend to be the king. Those kinds of stories are out there. I don't know how often anything like that actually happened, but they do have movies and other novels, stories where that mistaken identity is there. The other big storyline would be forbidden love. That's always a big storyline. Forbidden love, and the forbidden love would be that some noble guy is in love with a peasant woman, or vice versa, and so that creates all kinds of troubles. Right? It goes all the way down to Shakespeare, right? Bill Shakespeare. All right. How did you get me onto that stuff? I don't know. You always do. So this is the feudal society. Now, what can happen is this feudal society works pretty well. Like I said, if you have a limited population, it works well. But what begins to happen, it also works well if the king is powerful. Remember, this guy at the top of the pyramid here has got to try to keep all this together. Because what you might imagine would happen is once, if I'm the king and I turn over a bunch of this land or use of the land to a duke, the duke might actually rise up against me, conspire against me. Or maybe a couple of these dukes get together and say, hey, let's knock off the king and we'll divide everything up between us. All right? That kind of thing could happen. As long as the king is very powerful, then this remains powerful. But as time goes on, it can happen that feudalism can lead to decentralization. Now remember, when the king would divide up his land and turn it over, say, to a duke, that piece of land was called a fief. Fief. F-I-E-F. Fief. Or a fiefdom instead of a kingdom, a fiefdom. So you would have your fief, and you'd make your oath of loyalty. So fief holding then can start to get confused when the king begins to break down, his authority begins to break down. So that in fact, sometimes what we see is that it doesn't follow this nice, I guess what I'm saying, it doesn't follow this nice, neat pyramid, like in the diagram you see here, which is very confused. The king starts to have direct relations with maybe certain knights or certain counts and bypasses some of the dukes. Vice versa, maybe one knight has sort of divided loyalty between a duke and a baron. All this stuff starts to happen, and things, it needs a reshifting, but of course, as time goes on, it gets to be harder and harder to do. Okay? So, consequently then, if the power of the king is weakened, and I think that's got cut off by that diagram, power of the king is weakened, and then we have a growing population, what we really need to do then is shift to a different form, a kind of modified feudalism. So this decentralization is talked about in chapter 10 of your textbook. In fact, chapter 10 in your textbook is talking about how things get centralized again, and how we actually see the emergence of larger countries. You see, if you ask somebody, let's say around 800 AD, what are you? Right? You ask people today, they might say, well, I'm an American, right, or something. Or around here, mostly everybody's Canadian. That's what I've noticed. I'm Canadian. They're a bunch of Canadians. I don't want to say anything bad about Canadians or make any generalizations, but I don't trust them. The Canadian. The Canadians make their money with the same names as ours and the same size. Coincidence? They can make their money anything they want. They make their coins, it looks like a quarter, but it's only worth about 15 cents. They come and put it in our vending machines, wreck our economy. They take all of our jobs. Well, anyway, don't get me started on the Canadians. And what do they have? When have you ever had anyone say, hey, let's go to this great Canadian restaurant tonight, or whatever, for lunch? No, because there aren't any. What would it have? I guess they'd have pancake, maybe maple syrup and Canadian bacon, which isn't really bacon. Anyway, I don't know why you got me started on the Canadians. But anyway, there's a lot of Canadians around here. That's what people would say. I'm a Canadian. Except Canadians, they never say that. They try to pretend that they're not Canadians. Anyway, but if you would have asked someone around 800 AD, they would not have said, I'm French. They would not have said, I'm English. They would not have said, I'm Spanish. They wouldn't have, or German. They wouldn't have identified them that way. They would have identified themselves with a different group. They would have said, I'm Saxon. They would have said that I'm an Angle. They would have said, I'm a Frank. They would have said, I'm a Burgundian, or whatever. All these smaller groups. But what we start to see emerging in the later medieval period are, these larger nation states are beginning to form. That's part of what they're talking about with this emergence and growth of European kingdoms and nations eventually. And that's happening in this period between 1000 and 1300, the High Middle Ages. We begin to see that. Part of that comes about because of all the confusion that brings and decentralization that brings here. There has to be a shift. Feudalism has to sort of shift into something else. All right. Then we see the growth of centralization. The kings decide to try to keep a lot of the power themselves. Right? Instead of subdividing into feudalism, they decide to keep it themselves. They had more options to be able to pay for things rather than just use the land. Of course, they're deriving a lot of their wealth from the land, but they can now use the wealth to pay for military items. Also, the kings, of course, have options available to them that us regular folk will not have. They can extend their power through warfare. You know, if I think my yard is not big enough, if I was a king, I might say, well, I'll just go to war with the guy next to me here, and I'll take over his land. I'll have a bigger yard. And I can tear down his house. I'll probably keep his garage. Anyway, you know, I can expand my territories through conflict, through war. The other way, of course, is through marriage. You know, if you want to become wealthy, well, the easiest way to become wealthy is to be born to a rich person. That's the absolute easiest way and the most common way that you become wealthy is you are the son or daughter of somebody who's wealthy. Now, the second easiest way is to marry someone who is wealthy, right? I'm telling you stuff that other people won't say, but it is true, all right? My mother used to say it's just as easy to fall in love with somebody rich as somebody poor, so choose somebody rich. That's basically what she was implying. Okay, so I'm not trying to give anybody marital or dating advice. I'm just saying that's the second easiest way to wealth. Okay, so that's what kings had. The kings had titles. They had, prestige. They had power. So you can leverage that into a marriage with somebody who has access to things you might want, like land or titles or power. Okay? So, you might say, well, maybe a princess isn't going to marry me. So, but if I was if I was a prince, well, maybe I got a better shot. Right? And if I'm extremely wealthy, well, then I got even more shots, right? I'm none of those things, so don't worry. Okay, so they increase it through war and marriage. They use land then to gain the loyalty of nobilities as a perk. And they strengthen their government. They begin to centralize it so they can keep control. And they're going to then begin to rely on government officials. You see what it says? Government officials and hired soldiers rather than vassals. By the way, if I'm the king and I offer you a fiefdom, then if you accept it, you are my vassal. There's lord and a vassal. So now, basically what begins to happen is emerges a new system. Rather than this sort of feudalism, where I have this and you're the vassal and you have loyalty to me, I begin to say, you know what, that gets a little messy. I'm going to bypass that. I'm just going to hire soldiers. So I don't need your service, right? And I'll hire people to do my, write out my laws, enforce my laws. So I don't turn this over. Part of the problem is, see, if I turn this over to you, then you're going to want to keep that in your family. And you're going to want to give perks to maybe your friends. I lived for many years in Kentucky. 18 years. I lived in Kentucky, and I lived in a county that was rural. And there were just a few families that kind of ran that town and pretty much ran that county, right? I called them the five families. That was just my joke. I called them five families. The five families then controlled most of the real estate. They controlled, like, for example, who was going to be the sheriff, who would be elected to certain offices. And now, if you're the sheriff and you're supposed to go and arrest your uncle, you're probably not going to do it, or you're going to probably tell your uncle, hey, look, you might want to leave town, stuff like that. They're looking into you. So it doesn't always lead to fairness. Well, let's see how things begin to shake up here. How about a guy named Bill of Normandy? Let's talk about him, William. William, he's sometimes called the Conqueror. He had another nickname before he became the Conqueror, which I will not use here. It calls into question his parentage. It's called William to something else. I think he preferred the Conqueror, however, so that's what I will use. William the Conqueror actually comes from France, the northern part of France. It's called Normandy. He's sometimes called William of Normandy or William the Conqueror. In 1066, very important date, 1066 in the history of, well, Europe, certainly the history of England, he will cross the English Channel with his troops. He will invade England. He will defeat the king that's up there in England. His name is Harold. And at the famous Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, this is when William the Conqueror gets his name, the Conqueror. He conquers England. Then what he did, of course, is now he's got a bunch of new land. He already had land down in France, but here's a good way, it's a good example to show you how you get more land. You just go and take it. Now he's got enough land that he can sort of divvy out parcels for oaths of loyalty to his generals, to his dukes, the people who helped him in battle, who then become very loyal to him. But something else that he did that was a little bit different is he said that every subject, every person in his territory must take an oath of loyalty to the king. Without, a piece of land. It's just, that's your duty. You live in England now, you live in William's territory, you got to take an oath of loyalty to the king. Therefore, if you did something that was not loyal, you had not only made the king upset, you had committed a crime. Treason. Treasonous crime. You had gone against the government, you'd gone against the ruler. So William is now the King of England, but he's still the Duke of Normandy. So technically, he is a vassal of the King of France while he is the King of England. See how it starts to get confusing? Supposedly, he's supposed to be loyal to the King of France. But as you might imagine, he's not all that loyal anymore. Because now, he's as powerful, if not more powerful, than the King of France. So you see how this starts to get confusing. All right. That's our buddy Bill. Let's move on to Henry. Henry II, we're just kind of looking at England here for a little example, since we can't look at all of the nations. We'll pick one. I picked England. Henry II, 1154, 1189. He expanded the powers of being king, started a dynasty. He increases the role of the king's influence in court cases. One of the things that a king would be, a lord would be, in a medieval society, would be a judge. So, for example, he didn't necessarily have to be a king. If you were the lord of a piece of territory and there was dispute between two people on your land, let's say two farmers fighting over, let's say, some equipment, or maybe, is this my land or your land? I planted this crop, now I get to harvest this crop, and you say, no, that's my crop because that's my land, and now we argue about it, we cannot come to a settlement, then where are we going to go? Well, you don't go to the people's court. I heard Judge Wapner died recently. You probably don't know who Judge Wapner is. He was on television for many years. They had a television show called The People's Court. I don't know if that's still on. But it was kind of the forerunner to all these court television things. But you would come in and make your case, not to a judge like that, but to the Lord. And the Lord, he would listen and say, okay, tell me your side, tell me your side. And of course, kings had to do this as well. Well, this goes all the way back to the Bible, right? King Solomon, Have people come into him to solve a dispute. So anyway, what Henry started to be able to figure out was a way to expand his control over court cases, thereby expanding his power, and guess what? Expanding his revenue. Don't you think it's interesting that when somebody breaks the law, they're often charged a fine? Who gets the fine? The government gets the fine. You know, let's say you do something to me or do something to my property, and you get charged a fine. They don't give me the money. The government keeps the money, right? That doesn't seem completely fair, but that's the way it is, right? In other words, if the person has caused harm, like for example, some company, this happens often, some company does something, like they sell something unsafe or whatever, if it's a car or whatever it is, then the government will investigate and say, okay, this car company is being charged $10 billion fine. Does that money then go to all the people who own the cars, who bought them? Usually not. Money just goes to the government. They decide what to do with it. Okay. Well, same here. If he's got more court cases, he gets more fines. If he gets more fines, he has more revenue to do with as he chooses. Now, where he really gets into a battle is over the church courts. Why would that be such a battle? Well, it had been traditional, and I sort of mentioned this in part when we talked about, remember when Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, and then the question was, is it the Pope who has authority over the king, or does the king have authority over the Pope, the church and the state? The church had a long history of having its own court cases and its own courts and deciding its own things, and did not go into the regular courts. So let's say that there was a monk or a priest or something who had done something they shouldn't have done. They would be charged and put on trial not by the local nobleman or the king. They would go to a church court, an ecclesiastical court. They would then hear the case. They would decide the punishment. In part, the idea here was, of course, they say we have authority over church things. And, of course, it's also a way to keep the government out of taking the church's money. Because if somebody's a monk, they don't have any money. If they get charged a fine, guess who has to pay it? The monastery, which is really the church. And that money then goes from the church to the state. So this is, partially it's about money. Now, we don't have anything like that. The only thing we have like that today would be in our military system. Our military has its own set of courts. So if somebody is a soldier, when they do something wrong or they're accused, they would not be sent to a regular court. They'd be sent to a military court. The military court functions a little differently. The way they do the evidence, the way they make their decisions, usually there's not a jury or anything like that. It's decided by a judge or maybe a panel of generals or something. They have their own system of how they do it. And then, everybody else dismisses what they might have, and they turn it over to the military court. And then the military has its own prisons. Right? Got a big one out in Kansas. Leavenworth. Leavenworth is a military prison. I knew a guy who said, hey, I got 10 years in Leavenworth, or was it 11 years in Kenworth? He just couldn't remember. That's a joke. I know. See, if you got to explain that it's a joke, you've already lost. But a lot of this stuff's just for me. I just do it for me. If other people enjoy it, then. William of Normandy. Well, I have some dates there. I've never actually dated him, no. 1066 would be one date. Now, let's move on. What? I don't know. He's going to the prom with somebody else. I don't know. They probably don't even have proms. Do they still have proms? Seems like that would be out. Like nobody would want to go to one. They still have them?
Yeah.
Do they? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, it's good. Well, it's good to know some things don't change. King John. I'm glad somebody asked about King John. There are some dates for King John. Now, William the Conqueror, you might have to just look him up. I like this little cartoon. Again, this is just for me. Maybe you don't like it. That's okay. But take a look at the cartoon. Here's our buddy King John. Does he look happy? No, he is not. He's wrapped up. What is he wrapped up in? The Magna Carta. See that? This is the Magna Carta. Wait on here, and all these guys are rolling him up, binding him up, and carrying him off. Well, that kind of explains it if you understand the story. The Magna Carta, 1215. You know, we just had a big anniversary of the Magna Carta, right? 800 years in 2015. I'm sure you celebrated. You probably threw a Magna Carta party, right? Big you dressed up like Magna Carta and walked around. Maybe for Halloween. You know, my neighborhood, they have a big Halloween thing, I found out, because I just moved there. Hundreds of kids come there because it's a neighborhood that doesn't have the gated community thing, and most of them around here do, and so they figure they're going to get good candy in our neighborhood. Then they came to my house. That didn't work. But anyway, but there was a kid that comes, it's usually, I sit out there and give the kids the candy. Then I usually figure like it gives me the right to ask them, who are you? Right? Who are you? Like, oh, and some of them are easy for me, even me. Oh, you're Spider-Man. Spider-Man pretty much hasn't changed, the costume. Spider-Man, or you're a princess, or I don't know, a ghost. Some people come as a ghost, or whatever. But then sometimes they come, I have no idea who they are. No idea. I had this kid come up and, I thought, what is this? Who is he? He just kind of looked like a guy with like a sports coat or something. Okay, he was like a 12-year-old guy with a sports coat, which seemed very strange. So I said, who are you? He got very angry that I didn't know who he was. I still don't know who it is. But he said that he was a YouTube celebrity. I said, oh, sorry, I'm not up on all my YouTube celebrities. My favorite one, though, was a guy, he was probably about 13, came dressed as Hillary Clinton. He had on a pantsuit. Anyway, I could figure out who he was. So King John is forced to sign this document when all of the nobility basically, well, he was, King John has a reputation not being a nice guy. I don't like that because his name is John. I think he ought to be considered a nice guy, but he isn't. He was forced to then sign what's called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And a few years ago when I was in England, they were celebrating this. And so I got to see, I've seen about, there wasn't just one copy of the Magna Carta. There are, I might get this wrong, but I think there are 5 or 6, and I think I've seen all of them now. There's one that's in Washington, D.C. You can see it there. You go to the National Archives, they have a copy. There are a couple of copies in London at the British Library. Then there's a cathedral up north I went to that had one. So I've seen about 5 copies. I think I've seen all of them now. It's an interesting document. It's about this big. And like this, it has this thing hanging down from it, sort of a medallion, the official medallion of the king. And they made multiple copies so that they could take it to different parts of England so that everybody could read it, and I think probably so everybody could keep a copy in case the king tried to destroy. There was only one copy. Maybe the king would get rid of that one and say, hey, I never signed anything. So there were multiple copies of it. But it basically limits the power of the king. The king so England never had an absolute monarchy. That never develops like we see developing in France. Always has a check and balance, limited government, limited role of the king, balanced with the parliament, which is the nobility. The parliament eventually it has then 2 houses, 2 chambers. The House of Lords, which would be nobility, and the House of Commons, which would be non-nobility. Right? So they still have that today. And that's somewhat parallel to what we have, is our Senate and our House of Representatives. There are fewer in the Senate, There's many more representatives in the House of Representatives. And that makes up our Congress, as we call it. But there they call it their parliament. All right, so this will continue to develop along those lines. Now, I want to talk for a little bit of time. We've got some time left here. I mentioned in passing the development of universities, and I want to pick up this topic now, because this is something else very important that gets developed at this time in medieval Europe. Beginning around 1200, universities begin to develop. Take a look. You can see on this map, if you look carefully, places where universities begin. The earliest ones say that they are 12th century. I don't know if you can see that or not. They have the little red boxes, right? Little red boxes. One of the oldest ones, University of Paris. All right. You have Oxford University, the oldest one in England, and so forth. Well, universities begin around 1200. They begin to grow rapidly, so that by, say, 1400, there are over 75 universities. Now, as we said, say during the time of Charlemagne, most learning was done in monastic settings, monasteries. But as the population grows and as the need grows, there's not enough monks to go around and do everything they want. So they begin to set up a different kind of institution, usually near a cathedral school in a city, which eventually becomes a university. And this, instead of taking place in a monastery, would be normally in cities, maybe in towns. They would set up a university. Again, connected with the church, but not limited to a monastic setting. So it's run by the church for clergy. So technically, to go to university, you had to be a member of the clergy. Now, again, they begin to more broadly define clergy, depending on what your definition is of clergy. Their definition of clergy is much broader. Okay? Now, the training in universities, much of it we still follow today. It certainly sets the model that we've often used in education. With the 7 liberal arts, as they're called. 7 liberal arts. Now, these aren't always things we even teach today, or maybe not in the same way. But here they are, this nice little graphic. Music, you see grammar, astronomy, rhetoric, logic, geometry, and arithmetic. So you have the trivium. These are supposed to be the basic things that everybody should learn first. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar, of course, means how to write, how to read, how to recognize all the grammar of reading and writing. Rhetoric is how to speak. Now, this is something we really don't teach much today. I mean, I guess here at the university we have speech classes. I don't know, is everybody required to take a speech class? Yes, no, maybe. It must not be everybody. But that rhetoric is not only learning how to speak in public, but learning the whole process of speech, of persuasion and information and all those kinds of things. So it was very important. And then logic. Logic, being able to look at a situation and being able to break it down into parts. Sort of thing. Okay. Then the quadrium were the other 4. Right? Astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. A lot of stuff left out of that, but these were considered the 7 liberal arts. That was sort of your basic education. All right? But then they would also offer education in what they considered to be higher disciplines, which you would build upon. Once you had your basic, you needed these 3 basic things, then you add the other 4. Now you've got your basic education. Then on top of that, you would add other higher disciplines, more specialized disciplines, including things like law and medicine, theology. Okay? And by the way, the law, since remember there's a church court and then there's a secular court, you would learn both, the civil court and the canon. The canon would be the church court. All right, so typically a lot of people then either study medicine, law, or theology. Okay, so again, this is sort of basic organization of education. So again, some of this is going to look familiar to you. If you got your basic education, that is a trivium, then you would receive a bachelor's degree. If you went on and completed the quadrivium, then you could get a master's degree. And if you went on for this higher learning, then you could get a doctorate. Well, once you had a master's degree, then you could apply for a license to teach. So you'd have to have a master's degree in order to teach at the university, which is still a requirement today. Okay? If you want to teach at a university, you have to have some kind of master's degree. And probably in addition to other things, right? And then you could continue on training in other higher disciplines, like we say, and once you had completed those, say in theology or law or medicine, then you would be called a doctor, a doctoral degree. So, take a look. Here is a drawing of a sort of typical classroom. You've got the teacher, you've got the students in this sort of library, they're studying, right? Our idea of a classroom, our idea of lectures, our idea of the degrees, the kind of robes people wear when they graduate, all these kinds of things really come out of the medieval world. Now, by the way, all of the instruction was in Latin. So if you wanted to go to the university, you had to know Latin. Just a requirement.
Was in Latin too, like in
Yeah, Latin was everywhere. Latin was the language of the church. Latin was sort of the universal language. But you're right, there were other languages around, like French and English and German and Spanish. Those were considered to be vernacular languages. Vernacular means the local language. But there was not instruction in those languages. The teachers, the professors, would lecture and answer questions all in Latin. Anything that you would write it all in Latin. Anything you would read, you'd be reading it all in Latin. So any book you got a hold of would be in Latin. Anything you wrote would be in Latin. Anything you were hearing would be in Latin. Even if once you got out the door, you're speaking another language. English or something. And one thing that's allowed then was for these universities to be what we might call international. In other words, you could come from England or France or Italy or wherever. You could all go to the same university. You don't have to worry about the language. The language is all in Latin. No matter where you're from, you need to know Latin. So your exams were typically given orally. How would you like that? And in public. So the professor would kind of grill you in front of everybody and have you answer orally. By the way, there were very few books. It's much like today, what I find in the classes, and most students think, they don't need the book, so the only person who has the book is the professor. We're kind of gone back to that now. I hope I'm joking. But anyway, not too much. I had a guy last semester, he said, I need the book. I said, yeah, I think you really need the book. He said, I don't need the book. He said, history's very easy. That'd be fine. And then a little later on, he's saying, I'm not doing so well. What can I do? I said, well, maybe one thing you might want to do is get a hold of the book and read it. And he finally came back to me one point. He said, well, I borrowed a book. I read some of it. Didn't help. So I need the book.
You need the book to be exciting.
Anyway, it's all optional, So anyway, at this time, only professors had books, not because the students refused to get them, because they were very expensive and in very limited numbers. So the professor would have a book and perhaps read passages to you and that sort of thing, tell you about what was in the book. See, here he is. This kind of looks like a classroom, doesn't it? There's a guy up front with a book and a lectern. You can put the book up there. Down here are the students. Theoretically, they're taking notes, but I think really they're texting each other. They're updating their Twitter and Facebook accounts. And of course, the guys sitting in the back are always the best students. As usual. Everybody looks. Some of them didn't even notice I said that. So there are, we're only male students, ladies, sorry. No ladies allowed in the medieval university because you had to be a member of the clergy, and the clergy can only be males, and they didn't really have it set up for the ladies, so it was only men. You would begin your studies, not unlike ours, about the age of 17 or so, which usually most college students are about 18 these days when they start. Not always, but when we say someone's a traditional college student, usually they're between 18 and 22. 17 and 23. Of course, some people squeeze that 4-year degree into, 7 or 8 years. So they're here until they're about 30. That's all right. It's fine with me, like the guy that doesn't buy the book in my class, I'll probably have him back again the next year. Or somebody else will. That's all right. Maybe it'll work the second time around.
Wait, so this is only for male students?
What's that?
So it was only for men?
The university was only for men at this point, yes. Only for the males. No ladies invited. Yeah, it was a very male-dominated society. And the university, by its design, was for clergy, and clergy at that point was only men. So they didn't really have a rule that said no women can be in the university. They said you have to be a member of the clergy to be in the university, and of course to be a member of the clergy you have to be male. So anyway. Most of the students were not, you might think, well, they're all the rich kids that go. If you're nobility, you probably don't bother with the university. You don't really need to, right? But if you're sort of middle class, if you have enough finances that your family could afford to, have you go off and basically goof around for 4 years. Take a 4-year vacation in Florida. You hang out at Disney every weekend and go to the beach. These are all hypothetical. I'm not saying anything here. Well, most of them are sort of what we might call middle class, even though they don't really have a middle class then. They are peasants, but they're peasants that have, they're not real impoverished, they're not serfs, that sort of thing. And typically you don't have the nobility going because the nobility really doesn't need to do this. All right, the other thing about education at this time is that they run it like a guild. Remember we talked a little bit about guilds or professions. And so they run it that way. So the guild then sort of oversees who can be taught, who can be allowed in, who gets the degrees, how everything is paid for. All that is sort of operated like say if you were going to go and learn to be a blacksmith, there would be rules set out for how that would be, and you would have to be approved by the blacksmith guild. Well, this is set up in that way. You have sort of what you might call a university guild, at least it's set up that way. At first, they were meeting in rented halls. They didn't have their own buildings. They just rent a space to meet. The students would then pay the professor as they walked in the door. See, as I think I've said in here before, I think most of you are paying something to be here. I don't know. I don't want to know. Yeah, $10, $15 a year, whatever it is. But you see, I don't have anything to do with that. In one hand, I don't. On the other hand, of course, I'm completely dependent upon that, right? Because if there weren't students paying for classes somehow, then I wouldn't be paid. I wouldn't have a job. But we remove that element that you are paying me to be in this class. You don't probably think of yourselves paying me to be in this class. You think of yourselves as paying the university to be not even in this class. You're just paying the university to get a degree. And you have to take this class to get that degree, which I assume is why most of you are in here, because you have to be in here. So, but we remove that whole element of, imagine, in the medieval times, as you walk through that door back there, I would probably be renting this room. The university was, probably I was. And then you pay me when you walk through the door. I use that to pay the rent. I use that to pay me. And I'm sure I got to give some to the guild. And that's how we do it. I'm completely removed from that situation. I don't collect money from you. You don't pay me anything. Although last semester a guy tried to pay me. The same guy that didn't buy the textbook. Later on tried to pay me. Seriously. He walked right up at the end of class, and he opened up his wallet, and he said, look, I'll give you all this money. It looked like, a couple $100, or at least $100, if I would, basically sort of give him the test. I said, well, I'm not going to do that. He goes, go on, it's okay. I said, no, it's not okay. I'm not going to do that. Anyway, he was an interesting student. Very forthright with his desires. Anyway, so like I said, the university also brings together students from all over, because remember, you don't have to worry about language. Everybody's doing all this in Latin. And if you're going to go, you have to know Latin. So that means you might come from England, you might come from Spain, you might come from Italy, you might come from France or Germany. You might all end up in the same classroom together listening to stuff in Latin. So it does bring a kind of mixing of people that maybe had not happened before. Because most medieval society early on was very local. Also, it brings about conflict. Between the local areas and the university. In other words, the universities are located in towns and cities. There was conflict between the people who lived in the town and the people who connected with the university. I'm sure that never happens here in Lakeland. What do we got? We got 3 or 4 universities here in Lakeland of various kinds. So, what the university sort of types would say is, well, the people in the town take advantage of us because they know we're from, the university. They charge us more for rent or whatever. They know I'm a student at this place, and they know that I don't live here. And so when I go in, they charge me a higher price than somebody who's local. Okay? Stuff like that. That was part of it. Then, of course, the people on the other side say, well, those university students, those university people don't care at all about this town. They're not from this town. They're not part of this town. They just use our stuff, and they make trouble and, have parties and whatever. So we don't like them. So conflict, town and gown. So disputes would take place. In fact, one of the disputes happened within the university, ended up that the Oxford University, splits from the University of Paris over the disputes of a lot of the money and so forth. That's really how Oxford University got started. It split off of that, and then a bunch of the professors and students just said, okay, we're going back to England. We're going to England and start our own thing. And they did. And it's been there for quite a while. I'm going to Oxford this summer. That's the plan. To give a paper at a conference. So I always enjoy going there. I like the new college. They have one that's called the New College. It's only been there since 1640. It's new. Anyway, conflict between the townspeople and the students, sometimes called town versus gown, because people would wear their gowns, their robes, academic robes. Okay. We only wear them on, like, I have a gown, right? I end up wearing it, I think, twice a year now. I think they want me to wear it in December, and they want me to probably wear it again in May. A lot of times they only wear it once a year or twice a year. But there they wore it every day. I mean, that was their regular clothing. Especially in the winter, it was to keep you warm. And it had a functional thing. Actually, so when you walk around town with your gown on, it was sort of like your overcoat, so to speak. And you need that around here. If we have a day that only gets up to 63 degrees, I mean, you have to wear your winter clothing here in Lakeland. when it's so frigid out as to only get into the 60s. I saw people last fall. They're going around. It's like, it's going to be 65 degrees. I'm walking around with a shirt like this. I see people with like parkas and hats. What's going on? I said something to somebody. I said, it's very brisk weather. It's very cold. I love it. I love it when it gets cold like this. Oh, okay. Well, sometimes there were riots and high prices. Here's some people wearing these academic robes, regalia, as we might call it. You can see how colorful they can be, and the wacky hats. Wacky hats people have. So, you have your sort of regular bachelor's robe, but then master's robes, you get a hood. If these are doctorates, you get these little lines, little things on the sleeve. Usually three black ones means a PhD. They all have, you'd be black or blue as a PhD. And then the colors of the hoods are all regulated too by the discipline. All this stuff has symbology, which is usually never explained to anybody, but it is. And it all can find its roots anyway back in medieval Europe, and we keep it around because everybody likes the ceremony of it, pageantry, having all the faculty march in with all these robes. You think it's cool? You like it? It's cool?
Even though it's boring, it's kind of cool.
It's boring but cool. Okay. Well, that's fair enough. I mean, there's something that's, like for the first 10 minutes, I kind of like it. I got to put my robe on. I got to drive across town, put my robe on. Then I got to sit around for like 4 or 5 hours. Then take my robe off and drive back home. But, otherwise, it's pretty good. And I get to share in the experience and the celebration of all the students, which, of course, that's why I'm there and why I love it all. I want to be there for the students. In my monkey suit. I call it my monkey suit, my robe. Of course, I've never seen a monkey in a robe like that, but it would be fun. Wouldn't it be fun to see a monkey in a robe like that? See? I come up with some ideas that are okay. Now, so when we see the names of the degrees, the awarding of things, the group instruction, like we all come here, we have classes and 40, 50 people in a class, and we have sort of a lecture and different things going on. That whole system started back in medieval times. The scheduling, the licensing of teachers, the curriculum, and developing curriculum. The commencement, where everybody wears these priestly garbs, the cap and gowns, and march in with the music, very usually very regal music, maybe pomp and circumstance or something. It's all very much fun. So certain schools began to be identified with certain disciplines that they would specialize in, say for the doctoral level. Salerno became well known for medicine. Bologna, both of these in Italy, for law. Paris was well known as a school of theology. Okay, so and we kind of do that today. Schools are kind of known for specializing in certain things. So these are current influences. Now, the other thing that sort of develops at this time in Europe is a movement called scholasticism. We mentioned it in passing before. Let's have a few screens here. We'll see how much time we have, and I may have to finish this and then just post it online, as I sometimes do, because I didn't post 2 last week. I know, that was bad. We only had 1 last week, so this week we're going to have 2. They might actually be a little bit longer. Around 15 minutes. You got to make up for it. I don't want you to miss out. So we see the attempt to merge or relate faith and reason. How does reason relate to faith? And again, we don't have time to go into that whole debate. But one of the things that they were doing is taking a look at faith and reason and trying to harmonize them or bring them together. Excuse me. So ancient writings are coming into Europe from the Middle East, as we mentioned when we talked about Islam. Primarily one of these was Aristotle. It's going to affect faith and reason. Aristotle uses inductive reasoning. He likes to examine everything. So this scholasticism is much that way. And they want to look at things systematically. Perhaps you could take a course here. I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if you could take a course here called systematic theology. Systematic theology. I don't know if it's in the curriculum or not. It's in a lot. But systematic theology would mean is we're going to take a look at theology. Theology is just the study of God. We're going to look at it systematically. So it usually breaks things down. First of all, how do we know anything about God? Then we take a look at God as a creator, God as a redeemer. We look at salvation, how God brings about salvation. We look at the Holy Spirit. We look at the Son. We look at the Father. We look at all these categories about God in a systematic way. Then we look at other things, not only salvation, but we look at eschatology, the end times. We look at, pneumatology, that's the study of the Spirit, Holy Spirit, and so forth. Anyway, all this sort of finds its roots back here in scholasticism. The scholastic movement then tries to organize biblical teachings logically. To show you this kind of logic that they come up with, they're the ones who really invent encyclopedias, of which it's hard to find any encyclopedias in print anymore. They're all online. But this idea where I could look up the letter B and we would list everything that starts with a B alphabetically, from, I don't know, banana to whatever's at the end there. So we start with aardvark and we end up with, zebra or something. And we're going to put everything in there. How do we organize it? Just alphabetically. But the idea that we could collect all knowledge into a set of books and to organize it in a way that we could look it up quickly begins at this time. They also developed the idea of outlining. If you ever had to do outlines where you had to use Roman numerals and regular numbers and letters and put them all together and have, this is A, this is subpoint 1, and so on. All of that stuff kind of begins back here with scholasticism. And we still have it today. Okay? So scholasticism then will affect our approach to theology, but also affects the approach to a lot of other things as well. Let's see if I can do one more screen before we have to go. I think we can. What causes this? As I already said, Aristotle's work, and we talked about this before, Aristotle's work had been preserved in the Middle East and expanded upon by actually Islamic scholars. But a lot of these works then are translated, and their comments, like Averroes or Maimonides, these guys were a Jewish scholar, an Islamic scholar who studied Aristotle. They made extensive notes like a commentary on Aristotle's writings. And then these things get translated out of Arabic and Hebrew into Latin. So we actually have the Greek, which is going through Arabic and maybe Hebrew, and then it ends up in Latin. And now all these sources are available, and it really begins to affect it. So these Middle Eastern preserved Islamic commentaries on ancient classical sources are now beginning to be brought into the line of thinking. It's taken to the universities, and people really begin to study it. Well, we will end it there. Remember, your test is this week. By the way, the next week, not to lay a burden on you too much, that's when you do the Charlemagne test. I didn't want to give them to you both the same week. Okay? But we'll talk about that next week. All right. Have a good weekend. Scholasticism and some of the causes of scholasticism. We've mentioned the works of Aristotle, and then the works of those who wrote commentaries and translated many of these works, and then it enters into European culture in Latin. There was a lot of interest within the monasteries for philosophy to be able to use, like, say, the teachings, the philosophical teachings of Aristotle, and to apply them to Christian theology. And so through the Dominican monks, Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great, they were able to bring about the infusion of Christian theology with the philosophical ideas of Aristotle. Others like William of Ockham and Bonaventure would also do this, and they were Franciscan monks, so it wasn't just limited to one monastic order. We also see then that scholasticism, as we said, is trying to organize everything, encyclopedic forms. They also wanted to organize everything that was truth or accepted truth, and they wanted to show that Christianity and faith is reasonable. To do that, they're going to use the logic of Aristotle. Aristotelian logic will be used to try to show that the basic beliefs of Christianity are reasonable, are logical. The greatest of all these, and we've mentioned him before, his name is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was the greatest of all the scholastics. Some of his classmates and those who knew him, I think, perhaps were intimidated by him. They called him the dumb ox, but he certainly was not dumb. He was quite intelligent, probably genius level, I guess. And he studied with Albertus Magnus, as we mentioned before in the previous slide, but he studies at Cologne. So really, most people would say it's Aquinas who Christianizes Aristotle or baptizes Aristotle and his teachings and brings it over into a systematic view of theology, a systematic view of truth. Thomas Aquinas is a prolific writer, and his greatest work is called his Summa Theologica, or sometimes just called the Summa. Now, this means a summary of theology. This is a systematic view of theology. He writes over 40 volumes on this. If you think maybe my handwriting is bad, take a look at his handwriting. Hard to read in Latin, but still hard to make out almost anything of that. He tries to reconcile Aristotle and Christianity. He tries to reconcile faith and reason. He tries to take a look at sort of universal truth. He sees faith and reason as sort of the distinction between philosophy and theology. And he tries definitely to harmonize the two. Thomas was quite concerned with what is called natural theology. That is, what can we learn from nature that can teach us about God? So in other words, we look at creation. Of course, it's very Aristotelian. We examine the world around us and we try to find in it clues of what would tell us of what God is like. Okay, so we look at the design. We look at the immensity of the universe. We look at the design of even small things like leaves and flowers, and we look at the beauty that's there. All these things he's saying from nature then can help teach us about God and theology. Now, one of the famous things that Thomas would work on was to try to do a proof, sort of a philosophical proof of God's existence, in which he called it the 5 ways. These are supposed to be logical ideas, logical proofs that would, the conclusion of which would necessitate the belief in God, that God must exist. So one of these would be motion. Everything is in motion. The idea here is that things had to be set in motion. That, in other words, logically, we have cause and effect. If we see, for example, basketball rolling down the sidewalk, we assume someone has rolled the basketball or started that basketball in motion. And so therefore there is a cause to the effect that we're seeing. Say this basketball rolling across the parking lot. So with this, then the idea is if you go back and say, well, things are in motion. How did they get in motion? Who put those things into motion? And so forth. By going backwards, we would then get to the first entity that caused motion, and of course that would be God. So there must be a first mover, I guess you might put it. There must be a mover who started all the other motion. So God is that prime mover or first mover. Another is about cause, that we see cause and effect. So it's a similar idea that for every effect there is a cause, and therefore the idea is that there must be a first cause. The third one is called contingency. Contingency. This is the idea of potential. This one may be a little bit harder to explain quickly, but it's the idea that everything that exists has the potential not to exist, so therefore it is contingent. So let's say an individual, you have parents, so you have there's a potential that your parents perhaps wouldn't have had you as a child, or maybe perhaps had never met and wouldn't have been having any children or so forth. So that we could imagine a scenario in which, let's say, I didn't exist, or in which certain other things didn't happen because they are contingent upon other things happening first. And those things were not necessarily had to happen. But by using this sort of logical way of looking at it, he would say that, well, God must exist, and therefore there is no contingency that would say God, there's no scenario we can come up with to say, well, God is conditional or contingent. Therefore, this proves that God exists. Therefore, God is the only necessary being. All the others are contingent beings, and God is the necessary being. He's the prime mover. He's the first cause. He is the necessary being. So obviously we have two more ways. Degrees of excellence. This is the idea that we say, okay, we go look at anything. Let's say a hamburger, or let's say we like hamburgers, and we say, well, this hamburger's good, but we can imagine that this hamburger might be better, or that there might be one that's worse. In other words, there are degrees of excellence to whatever it is: an apple, a hamburger, a tree. We say, well, this is a good tree, but maybe the tree could be bigger. Maybe the tree could have its limbs straighter, or whatever. We can imagine that there are degrees of goodness that are there. So therefore, we're saying that some things are good and some things are better. Goodness then comes from what is best or what is perfect. So goodness then is a sort of conditional, that there's actually something supreme that's good or perfect, of which this goodness is a kind of reflection of it. And of course God is that. The fifth way has to do, we might call it harmony, or how things work together, working towards an end. In other words, that there is design in the world. We look at the way different systems, let's say within our body, works, and how they cooperate, and keep things in balance. Or we look at the way in which we see the design of plants or animals, or even the stars or anything else we look at. We see a kind of design to it. And if there is design, then that would then say there must be a designer. Therefore, God would be the ultimate designer. I have a picture here of a watch or a clock. This was one of the images later on that they would use to try to explain some of this, is that if you there was a story that they would tell that someone was walking through the woods and they saw something glimmer out of the corner of their eyes, and they see it's a watch, a very fine pocket watch, and they had not seen one before, and so they pick it up and they see that it's moving, they see the hands that are on it, they can see it moves with purpose. They take the back off of the watch and they see that it's, if you've ever seen any of these old watches, they have a lot of gears in there. They see all these little intricate gears that are moving and so forth. And so they say, well, this watch didn't just appear here in the woods. Somebody must have designed it. Somebody must have made it. There's purpose to it. They had a reason for this, even if maybe I don't know all the reasons for this. I can see that there's purpose. I can see their design, and therefore there must be a designer. So in this case, there must be a watchmaker, a clockmaker, who designed the clock. Well, what then are the results of scholasticism? Certainly one of the, I suppose, positive effects is that it gave these things that the church was doing, the sacraments, the hierarchy, the teachings, an intellectual base. It gave them a reason, a rationale, sort of a logic for what they were, why they were there. So it gave this sort of intellectual basis to it. And Aquinas would teach then that reason precedes revelation, which, again, we don't have time to go into in detail, but this is the idea that, in other words, God gave us a mind. He wants us to use a mind. We must use reason and logic to figure out our world, and then when the revelation comes, that is, things that God reveals, it'll give us a framework for understanding that revelation. But what it does do, I suppose you might say this is either positive or negative, is it leads to a distinction between what is secular and what is sacred in the areas of truth. Secular truth, sacred truth. So sometimes this can kind of form a wedge there between truth. But certainly it created a lot more interest in the human beings, in the creativity of people, and what we might say humanism, or the study and the creativity, the design of humans as a reflection of the design and creativity and so forth of God. So in his Summa Theologica then, we'll see that Aquinas will unite philosophy, in particular Aristotle's philosophy, and religion, in particular Christianity. And this will change the way people look at religion, Christianity, theology for centuries, and still today it sets a framework that we have. Well, let's end that for now, and I hope you have a great day.